to an episode of the Skiffy and Fanty Shows at the Movies.
There are 3 conditions that have to be met in order for a malevolent will to remain in the world after death: an enclosed space, water, and a slow death, and an almost fanatical devotion to the Pope. 4 conditions that have to be met.
Oh my gosh, where'd you get that from?
That is a quote from the novel, apparently.
Oh, I've never read the novel, although it's
the English translation of the novel, at least.
Okay. Well, I'm Shaun.
I'm Daniel.
And on today's show, we're discussing the 1998 Japanese horror film Ringu, or commonly known as Ring, directed by Hideo Nakata and starring Nanako Matsushima, Miki Nakatani, Hiroyuki Sanada, and other individuals who are wonderful, and everyone's great here except for the child who's creepy.
The child is so adorable creepy.
Adorable creepy is not a thing you want in a child. I don't know.
It's not a thing. No. Oh, he's great.
Yeah, he's very fun. This is a movie that was instrumental in bringing J-horror excitement to the United States, inspiring Japanese sequels, as well as numerous American remake versions for this franchise and others. The other one would probably be The Grudge, which everybody should know, Ju-on in Japan, which has spawned multiple sequels both in Japan and the United States. This is based on a novel by Koji Suzuki from 1991. There are sequels in novel form as well, including, I believe, Spiral and Loop. Spiral and Loop, I think, is the other one.
And Spiral was made into a sequel to the movie as well, but it didn't do too well, so then they made a Ring 2.
Yeah, it's all... I mean, they're all on Shudder.
It's very convoluted.
It's very convoluted. Well, yeah, imagine me when I talked to David, and I was like, hey, David, do you have a thought about this? Because he's not here, right? And he's our resident horror dork. And I was like, what are your thoughts?
An essay?
He just like casually mentioned, well, there was a TV movie before this. And I'm sitting here going... Do I have time to watch this? Do I have time to watch this and also the American remake of this? And no, it turns out I did not this week have time.
No, I did not.
And to be fair, we should note this episode was going to be something else, but for reasons that aren't really anybody's fault, the episode that was going to be at this time had to be moved because technically this is a birthday weekend for multiple members of the Skiffy and Fanty Show, and some of us actually had travel
Happy
plans.
birthday!
Not me, although it is, at the time of this recording, 2 days before my birthday, so, yeah. Anyway,
what are you doing to celebrate?
I was grading.
You can watch 1995's Ring.
I could. There is a version on YouTube, by the way,
Ring in your birthday?
I will note, the original commercials.
Wow.
Which
that would be fun to watch.
I'm actually probably going to watch it with the commercials. I kind of find old school commercials interesting, but that's a whole other thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, before we get into our discussion, a reminder to please share your comments, questions, or suggested topics with us at skiffyandfanty.com/listener suggestions. If you aren't already, make sure to join us live each Friday at 7 Central on Shaun's Alphabet Streams Twitch, and be part of our interactive live streaming format, or join us anytime for interaction on our Discord. Finally, please join our Patreon and be part of our exclusive content, like giving us torture cinema movies to watch.
And I gotta do that.
Only takes... Oh, yes, the next one we got to get up. It only takes $1 a month. So let others know how fabulous we are and spread the word of Skiffy and Fanty.
Yeah, a small thing I should note is that if you join at $3 per month, every month, the Monday before the episode, which is usually the last Friday of the month, which is like the Torch Cinema episode we do live at 7 p.m. Central on twitch.tv/alphabetstreams, you can join us to watch the movie. I'm almost always there, and so it'll be there. Some of the other Patreon supporters will be there. And I will basically show the film, or we'll all have to watch it together off of a mutual stream of some kind. And then we talk about it in the chat as we watch it, which I find very
fun of it.
Yeah. And
it helps survive the torture.
Or you have fun because you all realize it's not nearly as bad as you were told, and you have interesting conversations about the things. Like knowing that, for example, Paul, who is not here to correct the record, used to be one of the most important members of Space Camp. Yeah, you didn't know that.
This is true.
Very true. Yeah.
There are records. Yeah.
Okay.
Going back over the old Torture Cinema episodes now to like get the information and data, I'm like shocked how many there are that people ended up, fairly well enjoying. We're saying like, this, it's not great maybe, but like I'd watch it again. It's not terrible. So, there are a fair number. It's like, how did these make it into Torture Cinema?
Yes, like
they're
Voyage
legit,
of the Rock
like,
Aliens.
good movies, right?
Yeah.
That's by far the number one rated. But like Rare Exports in the early days,
I honestly still don't understand why that one was considered bad, because like it's not a great movie, but it's kind of fun. And
it is, yeah.
It's very
it has issues, but not,
nothing by comparison to some of the other stuff we watched. No. Yeah. Well, anyways.
Birdemic.
Yeah. Don't. Okay. Well, we're here to talk about Ringu. Ringu.
Yes, sorry.
Or Ring. And so, Daniel, would you give us, frankly, this won't be, I think, that hard, the brief summary of what is this film about for people who don't know?
So, do we do any kind of spoilers? Do I summarize like the whole thing, or do I just stop the summary at some point?
I would give don't reveal the ending, but definitely give us like what is the thrust of the story after we know what the problem is. Okay. Yeah.
So, Ring is a story about a journalist named Riko Asakawa, and she's investigating the recent deaths of several high school students, including the death of her niece, where the teens mysteriously died looking like frozen in shock and fright. And there's an urban legend going around amongst like the school kids, amongst their friends, that they had watched a cursed videotape that had a mysterious, strange woman appearing in it. And then right after watching this weird tape, they received a strange phone call, and in 1 week they would die. And indeed, 1 week following those events, that's when these teens were found dead. And so Riko is investigating this, and as part of that investigation, she actually discovers the VHS tape in question and happens to watch it. And right after she does that, she has this, fear now that in a week she's going to die like these teens have, like her niece has. And so she ends up enlisting the help of her ex-husband, who is a university professor, but more importantly, he has sort of like psychic type abilities where he can detect supernatural auras or detect things that are coming. And so he has a little bit of a special perception on these potentially supernatural type events. So he, Ryuji Takayama, Ryuji and Riko then begin investigating what happened to these teens, and particularly the history of this tape. And so as they investigate the tape, they trace it to a region of Japan where they discover a story of back in basically right after World War II, there was a woman that had ESP type powers and was actually being the subject of research of a doctor named Dr. Akuma that was studying her ESP abilities. And she predicted the eruption of a volcano, but people didn't believe her, and they ridiculed her supposed psychic abilities. And so she ended up throwing herself into the volcano in suicide. So they begin to discover, and through Ryuji's psychic abilities, begin seeing images and scenes from the past of actually what happened, and realizes that Dr. Akuma had an affair with this woman, whose name is Shizuko Yamamura. So he had an affair with her, and she also had a daughter. And that daughter is perhaps then both the mother is the woman that appears in this mysterious VHS recording, but then also the daughter is potentially involved in it. But as they're trying to figure all this out, perhaps most potentially damaging is that their son, who the father is pretty much estranged from the son. What is the son's name? Yoichi.
Yoichi. Yeah, Yoichi.
Yeah. Young Yuichi happened to watch the video as well. He was basically urged on by the ghost of his relative, but really it was probably this vengeful spirit that was pretending to be the ghost of his relative that urged him to watch the tape. So he watched it, so now he's in danger of dying in 1 week. And so basically the countdown is on, and they're racing against the clock to try to figure things out before Riko and before Yuichi. And also Ryuji ends up watching it, so before all of them can die.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment of the film. So it's worth pointing out, and I think it's a thing that probably people are going to note anyway, which is part of why this film is perhaps so influential is obviously it spawns an American remake, and then necessarily a handful of others of varying degrees of success. Ring from 2002, which is the American remake of this film, is both relatively well liked, but also somewhat reviled because there's a lot of conversation about, well, what are you doing when you remake a film in a different cultural context? What parts of this film are perhaps uniquely Japanese by comparison to a film that you translate into a different context? I would submit that the 2002 Ring certainly is making it in an American context, but is effectively the same film reduced to its most basic themes, and then with just some ramped up terror, I suppose you could say, because they play it up a little bit. But
it
it's
adds
otherwise
more,
yeah,
adds more jump scares.
a little bit more.
And like the music is a little bit more like there's things I still haven't seen the American one. But from what I read, at least, it adds a little more scariness or creepiness to the video, for instance.
Yeah.
And Americanizes in making things more obvious than the subtlety that the original Japanese version may have. But.
And we've got a bunch of examples of this sort of thing happening, where something successful in another culture is then taken and turned into something in a different culture. Things like Death Note, for example, which I think actually is a better argument for really poor adaptation across culture in a way that The Ring isn't, because I think at the core, Ring is, the meanings might be different, but the core story is something you can tell in a lot of different cultural contexts, just somewhat differently. I did find a quote that I thought was interesting in talking about adaptation, which I want to note, this film is itself an adaptation just of a novel. And then naturally we're talking as an extension of adaptation via the remake. So this comes from Konstantin Varevas from 2004, and it's taken from a piece titled The Original and the Copy, Nakata Hideo's Ring in Japanese Cinema, Texts and Context, edited by Alistair Phillips and Julian Stringer. And it's a quote about this exact issue of adaptation. And that it goes as follows: as in the case of the film genre, a fundamental problem for film remaking has arisen from the ever-present desire for a stable and easily identifiable set of objects for analysis, and a related attempt to reduce film remaking to a corpus of texts or set of textual structures. In addition to problems of canonicity, these textual accounts of remaking risk essentialism, in many instances privileging the original over the remake or measuring the success of the remake according to its ability to realize what are taken to be the essential elements of the source text, the property from which both the original and its remake are derived. And this gets to, the central problem of all conversation of remakes is really, which is the same problem this film has with relation to its book version, and naturally the 2002 version has in relation to this film. Or you could even argue this film in relation to the TV movie, and then that in relation to the book, blah, 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 blah. Supposedly the TV movie is considerably more faithful to the book, which may or may not have issues worth addressing at a different time. But I think it's really interesting that myself have not read the book. In watching this film, I don't have that other knowledge. I only have the film that comes later that is an American film. And so I made comparisons immediately between how I remember experiencing the 2002 film when I was 19 or almost 19 years old, depending on when in the year that came out, and this film and how I felt. And the thing that really stood out to me, and I know I've talked a lot, but I'll just mention it and then you could jump in, which is the opening sequence, which is very similar to the 2002 film. And I remember being very captivated in the 2002 film and being very terrified in various moments in that film. But my heart raced the entire time. Once I knew what we were getting into, my heart was racing that entire opening sequence. It's so brilliantly shot and builds such tension and tricks in how it builds tension that when the bad thing finally happens, it is a cathartic release. But my heart didn't stop for a full 10 more minutes in the movie, even though after that scene, it's done. Where there really isn't a lot of scary stuff going on. And I don't know how you felt in that opening sequence, but I thought it was really brilliant horror filmmaking.
Oh, yes. I would agree with that. The opening shots and sort of the voiceover talking about the ocean. You have the violence of the ocean and talking about the ocean, the sea, the briny sea taking the life from people, that people living near it live in fear of it. And you start feeling from between, it's pretty darkly lit. And so it's dark. You have this foamy waves coming in. There's a lot of nervousness and trepidation already just from that. And then you enter into what is now a horror trope to some degrees of a bunch of school students talking about scary stories and trying to scare each other. And you getting the sense, they're walking around an empty house with dark corridors and shadows and something bad is going to happen, but not right then.
Yeah.
And so it is, I agree, it's really masterfully done. And the music during all of that, I think, is particularly powerful. I think right from that beginning, the music is almost like it's sounds. It's not always notes.
Yes.
They're sounds that put you ill at ease, but not scare you per se, just put you ill at ease. And so, like you said, once that moment in the sort of whiteout freeze frame shot happens of the death, it's almost like a cathartic release, like you say.
Yeah.
Which is done, that freeze frame then is so much better than other times that has been used in other horror films, I think.
Well, it has meaning here.
Just because of the way, because it has meaning, exactly. But yeah, in terms of the whole remake stuff that you're talking about, even apart from changing cultures, I'm not a fan of remakes.
Generally,
I just
I'm
don't
not
like
either.
the concept. If you want to talk about Psycho, for instance, was it Gus Van Sant that remade,
Yes.
a shot-for-shot remake of Hitchcock's Psycho? It's why? The original, why are we doing this? Most remakes, I don't... Even ones that I watched first not realizing they were remakes, once I realized I was kind of angry and disappointed. Like I wish he would have just told me about the original and I could have watched that.
Oh, that's
But
interesting.
if you change it enough, an adaptation is different than a remake to me. So like changing the format from a novel to a TV movie. Changing the novel to a movie, that's not as much as a remake as an adaptation. And you also get to the think, whether it be borrowing from cultures or stealing from cultures or adaptations, it's not just adapting the whole work, it's adapting themes or ideas from it.
Yeah.
So this isn't the first movie to consider cursed objects. It's not the first to treat urban legends in horror. So it's building already on a lot of things, but it's taking all of those and making and framing them in a very Japanese way.
Yeah. Yeah.
When you then take that and make a direct remake, like I'm going to take this Japanese version, but then you assume Americans are too stupid or uninterested to be able to just watch the goddamn Japanese version. So I'm going to remake essentially the same thing, but strip it of all of its Japaneseness. That is hugely problematic to me or concerning.
Yes, I think we're in this really murky territory because on the one hand, if we take something like Ringu or Ring, this film gets Hollywood interested in not only Japanese films, but a series of Japanese actors. It's not like Japanese actors hadn't been in Hollywood before they had, but, suddenly we're seeing more and more of it, kind of in this, in a different way from when bootleg kung fu movies with really terrible dubs started making their way over in crappy VHSs. Suddenly there's a culture that's suddenly interested, and now we're getting these things we normally wouldn't have access to. And
Hiroyuki Sanada from this,
oh my God, I love
he began
him.
being used a ton of times in
I want
more
him to
and
be
more
my
in
dad.
American productions, right? So yeah,
because probably his breakout role in America is technically The Last Samurai, although he's not the main character. Ken Watanabe is, and I just think Ken Watanabe is criminally underused in American cinema, and Hollywood needs to call me so we can fix that because he's amazing. But then he does a British film, well, I guess it's British by director or writer, which would be Sunshine, where he plays actually an American character. That's probably his American breakthrough. And now he's in Shogun, which has, as far as I'm aware, been getting a ton of press.
A ton of Emmys.
Yeah. So to me, it's really awesome that a film like this, by extension, probably not the only thing that helps break him into American audiences, but if you've ever watched him in both Japanese and in English, he's a remarkably good actor. There's a lot of depth in his performances that I really, really like, and he's great here as well. I found him kind of alluring because both of them, the wife and the husband, or the ex-husband, the way that this is acted, there's so much that's not explicitly told to us that we must interpret from body language. It's very clear that they do care for each other. It's very clear that he is upset with the fact that they've had a child and he's frankly been a deadbeat dad. He has a legit job, but he is not the father to this child, even though it's their child. It's very clear he has traumas of his own in the way that he performs, and that trauma impacts how he treats other people on a regular basis. He brings a very powerful performance throughout this. Both of them do, really. Yes. That I was just very hooked into that. This is just Sonata because he's just really good. Not to stereotype, but Japanese cinema does that really well. Japanese directors, Japanese actors, and it might partially be just because of the culture of being sparing and using words and conveying a lot by body language. But if I think of from movies of Ozu to Kurosawa to even more modern ones like Beat Takashi,
they all have that in common. They're conveying so much by the unspoken.
It's a trust in audiences, right? This
Yeah.
film trusts
Yeah,
the
that's
audience
true.
to
Yeah.
figure out a lot of what's not told to us explicitly, to interpret the film based on what we see, which I find really lacking in a good chunk of American cinema these days, where so often I feel like characters have to tell us how they're feeling. Either they have to like overact to the point, well, I mean, not overact. Overact's not really fair to the actor, but like be melodramatic in order to make it very clear to us like how they're feeling, or they just tell us explicitly. And to me, sometimes it's really nice to just like be in the moment and
be
have
able to find your own interpretation.
yeah, like we don't know why they divorced. We have to make huge guesses for why they're exes. My guess is it has a lot to do with the fact that he does have some sort of extrasensory perception, and that has affected how he's able to interact with the world in very disturbing ways. She also gets a little bit of this too, but it's through her interaction with the tape. But he has it like to really negative degrees, and it's given to us very early when he shows up for the first time at her apartment, and he's like physically uncomfortable in the space, and then he like tries to shrug it off and act like it's not a big deal. And so we're constantly sitting here wondering, does he believe her or does he not? Because his body language suggests he does, but he says the opposite for a while, at least until he finally just agrees that there is something weird going on, right? That I feel like is such brilliant filmmaking, because I can just watch that scene over and over and like really pick, like, look at what's going on here. Look at the scene, what's said, what's not said, and how do I reconcile those things?
Right. I interpreted him as being sort of dismissive of her, as him trying to not scare her or frighten her.
Oh, so he knows, but he doesn't want
Because
her
like
to
he
feel it.
knows, and he doesn't want to say like, oh yeah, you're fucked. Like this is
Yeah.
not good. We need to solve this. We need to figure this out. Like eventually, like as he realizes there's no way to sugarcoat this, he's like, we still have time. The clock, I forget the exact line, but there's still time. We have some time to figure this out. So I think from the very beginning, he knows. He's just trying to downplay it to not freak her out.
Yeah.
And not freak the son out, I think, to some extent.
That's an interesting thing. It is something that I think I've seen in other Japanese cinema, and I won't speak as like I'm an expert in Japanese cinema, but there's like a very particular gendering to the way they behave. The man must be stoic and like he doesn't express his emotions. He holds on, except when he's about to die, and then of course he can be all emotional. Right? He must hold it together because the woman is like a ticking time bomb. Basically, she's moments away from freaking out. Now, in her defense, it's not like she's upset by a hangnail, which would be like the really sexist, misogynistic view of women, right? She's terrified of the prospect of dying from something supernatural. So on the one hand, there's a very clear gender binary here, but it is one that's weirdly like logical. Like she thinks she's gonna die. Let's downplay it a bit because I need her not to think about it, and he must suck all that inside as much as possible.
Yes.
Yeah.
We might as well talk about it now, I guess, if you want to.
Go for it.
This movie's use of gender and how it might relate to the overall themes or aspects of the film, at least how I saw it. But one, the director switched genders of the characters from the novel.
Sorta.
And I found that, and also made them exes, where in the novel they're not.
And also switched the gender, sorta.
Okay. That you can tell me more about that. But
yeah.
As I watched it, I saw the movie as one being a take on sort of, you have the classic Japanese ghost story, but put in the modern context of videotape, so technology. So it's the merging of the very old with modern fears and technology-driven fears and uncertainty. But there's also the comparison between Reiko and the woman, what is her name now from the past?
Oh gosh, sorry. My brain just fell apart.
Now I'm trying to find it.
Shizuko Yamamura.
Shizuko, yes.
Yeah.
So there's the difference between those two, Reiko and Shizuko. Shizuko lived at a time where she had to fulfill the societal sort of place that women were put in the early 50s. Someone who suffered, who was in an affair with this married man who had kids of his own. She was not in a place of power, and she gives into suicide. Or becomes a victim to suicide.
Yeah.
But Riko is in a different era. She's a woman who's a journalist. She's living as a single mother. She's taking care of her kid and having a job. She's the one investigating things. She's the one under control here. And as the story progresses and as it ends, you understand she's really the one that's driving the survival here of things and the continuation. So to me, it was interesting that the movie presents two eras of women that had very different societal places and very different abilities to direct their own lives. Does that make sense?
Yes, because
they had completely different agencies and amount of power over their lives and the lot that they were sort of given. She has way more control over it, despite the curse. Yeah. She has more control over it. And so the movie did very interesting things of juxtaposing, even in her modern life, as you said, traditional Japanese values where the woman you have to be gentle to because she might freak out at any moment, but then also making her very independent and much more of agency. And so it was an interesting look at those Japanese cultural perspectives on gender, I thought, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're right to point that out, that the film is, at the very least, presenting us two very different time periods with regards to how gender is treated. I don't think we need to necessarily... We don't have to be experts in Japanese culture to read that into the film because, right, we're presented two very different versions. One where a woman is subject to, I would say, based on what we're shown, non-intrusive experimentation, but experiments nonetheless about her abilities, and who, from all that we can tell, has very little real agency over her life. She's sort of under the thumb, as it were, of both the men who are using her, although whether or not it is love that is going on there about how the child is made is unclear. But then...
And the brother who's very domineering.
The brother as well. Yeah. Versus all of the press at this point. I don't think there's a single woman in that sea of press people. And of course, immediately, once we're shown the scene of them, her making the predictions or whatever, and they go, oh, it must be a fraud. You're a fraud. Of course, who do they attack? It's not all of the men who have put her there in this position. It is, of course,
not
her.
the doctor.
Not the doctor. They mention, I think, that he's fooling us or whatever, but they don't really go after him. They go after her. That is flipped very clearly for us in the future, where there is at least one woman, possibly more women. I didn't look closely, in the newsroom as a reporter, as somebody fulfilling the story. Compared to what we're shown earlier, she has considerably more agency. She is raising a child on her own. In some ways, she is the most adult character in the entire damn movie because she has to be one, although we could have questions about her parenting skills later, which is a different question. But yeah, I think your interpretation is right. This is a story that is, I think, very interested in time and change at the same time as things that are beyond reckoning that can't be changed, which would be the horror, right? Some people have read this film and the book, I think, as well, as very much about like this perception. This is like post 80s Japan. Like we have this conception of like, look at all of what Japan has done. Modern times have come to Japan and it is growing and entering the new future universe. But they have read to some degree the Sadako as like the specter of the past, constantly always haunting you. You can never escape it. It's always there. I don't know really what to do with that, but I found that as a very interesting common interpretation, and also really kind of horrifying, as though like, I mean, we're supposed to be afraid of everything. I don't know what it is Japan's supposed to be afraid of per se about the past, unless we're interpreting certain things that Japan still doesn't admit to doing during World War II, which I don't know. I don't know. Yeah.
Makes sense.
It's wild.
So, one of the things I had hoped to talk about this was it might not be applicable only to Ringu, but also very generally. I'll often see people say they didn't like a horror movie because it wasn't scary. It didn't scare me. And this is an example of a movie where, I don't know, there's very few movies I'd say would scare me. This is a sort of like psychological horror mostly. The ending has a bit of like scariness to it. The video is sort of creepy. But like it's not using jump scares. It's not necessarily something to scare, but it's a lot of stuff that puts you sort of like unsettles you, right? Throughout. And to me, that's valid to just have that. Like, I don't see why it needs to necessarily be scary or frightening per se. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I definitely found this, I mean, I'm not going to have nightmares over it or anything, but I did find this to be a pretty scary film.
Okay. Primarily
because of the way it builds all the psychological tension. But I will also note that, I mean, I already knew the ending because, to be frank, the 2002 version has a very similar ending. So, where she crawls out of the TV. Sorry to ruin it for everybody, but like, it's really cool. And
I had forgotten that, and so that was a nice, because I saw this movie back when it came out, I think, probably in the theater.
Oh, cool.
But I haven't watched it since. And so I still had a memory of the well. I remember the crawling out and thinking that was really creepy and cool.
Yeah.
I had completely forgotten the whole crawling out of the television set. So that was a nice surprise to see again.
It was
after a few decades.
I think it's a thing that I don't know that this, look, I don't think that horror needs to be like, oh my gosh, I'm shaking in my boots and like I'm about to wet myself scary, right? Sometimes it can just be uncomfortable, or it can be about trying to make sense of what can't be made sense of, or in some cases just dealing with the realities of the unknown. Or the psychological, watching characters struggle as they try to deal with what's happening to them. I think those are all things that horror can do, and they don't necessarily need to be things that we explicitly feel in the moment of watching it.
Right.
Because I don't know that you can consistently really do that. So to me, really the more interesting thing is, are you able to empathize with the characters and what they're going through? And is that experience a horror experience? And in this film, very clearly so, in a way that I think sometimes like the over-reliance on the jump scare isn't. Because the jump scare to me can sometimes feel very cheap, right? It isn't, it's rooted in just making me feel the scary, but it isn't necessarily always rooted in what the characters are also feeling, right? At least if it is like in a very like basic way of like, the guy popped out of the room, oh my god, that's scary. Like, I can take value in that. I think sometimes a jump scare is great, especially if you build tension really, really well, because making the audience actually feel the scare is a great experience sometimes, but not all horror, I think, needs to do that. This film doesn't need the jump scare. I think the dread at the ending, or the dread in that opening sequence where we're seeing things building up and building up and building up until that moment, in very similar ways, the beginning and the end, where we're given the impression that everything's fine, everything's safe, and then it's not. That to me is enough, because we can empathize with the terror that they feel in that moment.
And both those, the beginning and the end, central to it was a possible meaning of the title, depending how you're looking at it, but ring of the phone. And the ring also, of course, the circle, the ring of the well. There's many levels of the word ring in here. But the ring of the phone was something I found way more creepy than I remembered. And I think it's just because it's so unusual now to have a ringing telephone. When the telephone rings, I get scared. Why is somebody calling? What is this going to be like a scam? Is it going to be bad news? Back when I was a kid, the phone rang all the time, and I was never worried because everybody was, calling me to say, hey, let's go play Nintendo, right? And so the actual ringing of the phone had way more of an effect now, I think, than when I originally watched this. And
Interesting.
the whole movie goes with the urban legend. It kind of builds from the urban legend of the fright over getting a phone call, when a stranger calls. The classic, I think it was 1974 horror movie, uses that of the urban legend of somebody being upstairs calling you on the phone. That Scream used in it's in the original Scream's opening that they took. And that also apparently is possibly a partial source for this movie. So there's a 1985 Iranian horror movie, or mystery, I guess, about a reporter investigating the sudden inexplicable deaths of a growing number of people who received a strange phone call informing them of how long they have to live. And so the title of that movie in, I'm assuming Persian, is translated, Persian. It's Zongha. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correct, but it translates to The Rings, as in a telephone ring. And so this is basically, or the novel, I guess, basically takes that kind of trope and adds on Japanese traditions of what do they call it? The Onryo ghosts, the Yurei ghosts. So it builds on, it kind of combines multiple things. So going back to your comment of the adaptations before, I think this works so well because it mixes that old and new and borrows tropes that already existed in horror, but does something completely fresh and new with them all.
I think this is such an interesting, so this era, late 90s through the mid-ish 2000s, there's this weird interest, at least in US cinema. I can't speak to all of Japanese cinema, with the technology, because this is a moment of a pretty big shift. You're talking 1985, where the VHS mostly doesn't really, I don't even know when the VHS actually exists, but it's certainly not widespread in 1985.
It wasn't widespread, but yeah, it was there. But
so the telephone makes the most sense. In this one, the telephone is a thing that is here, but it is not the central mechanism of contagion. It's just the delivery of the message. And the thing that is I think really important is this is a film that exists in this moment where technically the VHS is about on its way out. In 1998, it not quite there, but by the time the other Ring comes out, DVDs are here, and VHS is its death knell has begun. And now I was thinking about how do you do this film in a way that captures the modern, when we were youngish and this film came out, how do you capture that? Because on the one hand, right, part of what makes this such a scary, especially the ending of Ringu, right? You get to this end. I thought her smile at the end when she realized what she was doing was actually really kind of terrifying, because what she's doing is giving like a curse, like an STD to people, right? It's this
Right.
contagion that must be delivered by a technology that
To
even
become a
by
chain letter, effectively.
kind of like a chain letter, and it's very clear she has to take the VHS with her because the VHS player is perhaps not as widespread across Japan at this point, or at least that's the implication I take from it. By 2002, like you can, in American culture, like, yeah, almost everybody has a VHS
But she had
player.
to make a copy of it.
Right, you had to make a copy, but then, of course, why does she bring the VHS with her? She's going to give it to somebody else to make a
The
copy.
actual recorder.
Because it's her dad. Her dad comes from, like,
then
an era.
he's got a copy of it. And,
Yeah. But, like, there's this thing about, like, a very deliberate choice that has to be made in this of, like, you have to make a copy and then deliver it to somebody who watches it and makes a copy and must deliver it, etc. Which means people can still die, because if you don't know that information, you might inadvertently watch this tape, like get it at a Goodwill somewhere and you watch this tape. But in today's time, right, this would be just delivered digitally, right? Napster, like, exists by the time the other Ring, the American Ring, comes out. But, like, I think people overplay the idea that, oh, like, all of American culture, like, we should have seen the digital world coming. Like, no, but now we do. Like, if this were a TikTok video, simultaneously it increases the mechanism of infection, contagion, to maximum degrees. But it also means that there's always somebody else if something goes viral, it's being shared, so people are constantly moving it. So actually nobody ever dies because it just circulates. But you can't control it. Yeah. Whereas in this, I think, like, the terror it actually gets worse the further into the 2000s you get, because once people stop having their VHS players, how do you make copies?
Well, will it work if she makes, like, a DVD copy? I don't know.
We'd have to ask the doctor.
So I guess my interpretation kind of the end is that it's somewhat more hopeful, or tied back to what you were talking before in terms of history and memory.
Okay.
That by passing on the story and remembering the sins of the past, we are avoiding death from it. And so if you choose to read and know about the past and ignore it and not pass that information on,
oh my gosh,
it's as good as being the past coming and destroying you, of being consumed by demons, right? And so it's very much this idea that, like, this trauma of the past, digging up a body and putting the body to rest, that's not going to put things to rest. What needs to happen is you need to share the story and remember this person and what happened to her. And that's the way you escape the curse. And so I thought that, like, her smile is, and that's what's so awesome about this, her smile is both creepy and yet it's also, like, profoundly hopeful. And realizing that because there's a cure by remembering. It's dark.
She is going, like, to her dad.
Bad things from the past are dark, right? It's effectively like, I'm going to share the history of, like, Nazis with somebody. Like, it's not, some dark history of putting it on that, like, this needs to be shared.
That's a fair point, because what happens
it's
Sadako,
an interpretation.
Yeah. What happens to Sadako, the well girl, is really horrible, right? And some of that is, like, going to what is, like, the fundamental fears underneath this, which is not just fear of ghosts, but, like, fear of things that we don't understand that are potentially harmful. Because the story makes it very clear that Sadako can, I guess, kill people by choice. Her ESP talent seems to be that she can kill people. Hence why in the video she can also kill people, because of course she can. And her father is the one that ultimately murders her, but she doesn't get murdered just by, like, you just get killed and that's over. She's hit over the head and thrown down a well and then left there still alive until she died. You can imagine how long a little girl who maybe can't quite touch the bottom could hang on before she just drowns. And it's a very horrible, terrible death. So when she comes for people, this is, like, the kind of
they got a week like her.
Yeah, like, this is a terrifying reality too. Like, every character who apparently knew the actual story without the tape never came out publicly about it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the like doctor who like did all the experiments, he was like shamed, but he wasn't shamed because he murdered anybody or he was involved in this horrible situation where horrible things were happening. It was like, nah, he had an affair, and like, oh, it's that shame side. So,
Mm-hmm.
you know, on the one hand, like, yeah, Sadako is, as like some of the critics are kind of pointing out, is like this thing that is no longer part of this world, and that's why she's terrifying. But also, like, underneath this, as you're kind of pointing out, there is the stuff that people who are of this world did to her. They didn't try to understand her. They, as far as we can tell in this film, became afraid of her and murdered her.
Her, yeah. And we never really find out, like, we know that she killed someone with her powers.
The journalist.
But the journalist, but she, like, lashes out defensively because the journalist is, you know, attacking her mother.
To be fair,
verbally,
he deserved
at
it.
least.
So. Well, I mean, maybe not death, but...
I don't know about death, but yeah.
He's a jerk,
She's a child. She's a child, right? And so it's the question of what was done to her.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're meant to think of this, but we're also meant to be reminded of the fact that, you know, that all is very rational. Like, her rage is very rational, but the curse itself is beyond rational.
Beyond rational.
Because it's not punishing the people who are responsible, it's punishing everybody else with the knowledge. And like Takahashi, who I believe is the screenwriter for this, like, he says about this, like, the making of this movie, he says, like, we are afraid of the ghosts for one reason, that is, they don't belong to this world. How can we remove humanity from them when they must be played by humans? That is the most important point for representing their images in horror films. Taking away what makes them human so that they become beyond reckoning, which I would argue they don't quite succeed here, because you can tell she's still, like, and the story kind of needs you to remember that she used to be a girl, but they don't show her face for pretty much most of the film.
Say we never see her face because the hair covers it. Even
the hair covers it. Yeah, so there's something like almost uncanny with her, where she is simultaneously human-like but not human.
And also the people that watch the tape, their faces become sort of blurred and distorted in photographs. And so I wonder, you know, was there some kind of deformity in her face that we don't know about, that it was hidden by the hair? Is there some link there? Am I just looking for too much logic where it's...
I mean, to some degree...
Or a pattern where it's not necessarily needed.
I mean, even when they find her body, right? Her body is, like, decayed, and, you know, it holds her, the hair, it still covered it, and then, like, all of the... We don't really see the face, mostly because it's decomposed, but, like, it all comes off the skull. So even at the moment when we might have seen what her face used to look like, her face is a skeleton. It's like we know it's human, but it's not, because
it's
too
missing, late.
Yeah, it's missing all the bits that, you know, are facial bits, which we, you know, it still feels inhuman. It's a skull. Yeah. It's a thing where supposedly there's some, like, shift in, like, horror in Japan towards this kind of thing where you get media within media, which is, like, called, like, I forget what the title is, the name of it is, like, nested something. Nested construction, where you get, like, video or other kinds of technology within the technology. And then you get, like, the intangible and dehumanized ghosts versus, like, explicitly human ghosts. And then supposedly verisimilitude is part of this, but I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. But, like, this is part of the shift. This film in particular is probably, like, the major film that is described in that shift. And I need to go read more now, because I'm curious about where does this go. There's an article about it called J-Horror, Its Birth and the Theory Behind It by Shinsuke Mukae, or Mukae. I'm not sure exactly how to say the last name, which talks about something called Kanaka theory. I don't fully understand this. If we had David Annandale, maybe he would know about it, but Google it. You might find some interesting stuff in there. I didn't have a chance to read the whole thing. So,
well, David could also probably say more and more accurately than I might be able to, but this is also a turning point for horror in the U.S. cinema landscape, because this is, the period, it's around the time you have Blair Witch. Urban Legend is being made now, right around the same time, I think, in terms of exploring urban legends, but it's a very different horror story than what may have come right before, where you're still sort of beholden to the prior things. Like you had Scream in 96, not just 2 years, I guess, before, where you're still kind of emulating or trying to reinvent the slasher.
Yeah.
And this really opened up, and the embrace, I guess, of J-horror and the trends in Asia in general opened up for more, I wouldn't call them gothic, but they're more akin to like horror that you might get from the 70s in the United States. Like it's not gothic like The Changeling is, but the plot of this is much more psychological horror like The Changeling is.
Interesting.
And other 70s and early 80s horror, I would say. And so, yeah, this time period was sort of a return and a modernizing of that 70s, early 80s thing before slashers really took everything over.
Although there's also probably whether this
But David can tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, David could probably. I wonder maybe if David hears this, he'll send us an email. Because to me, I seem to recall, and I'd mentioned this at the very beginning of the podcast, that there was like a series of films that come after this, and I don't know if it's because of this film per se, or there's a trend just happening, but like that like idea of nested construction is also in a whole bunch of American horror films, where like the supernatural and technology start to interact. I was thinking here of like the film White Noise, which has is it Keaton in that? I think Keaton's in that. I can't remember. The premise being that in that one, we take all of like the like ESP, like ghost hunting detector technology, and like drag that to 11. Where you can detect in like video signal ghosts and other kinds of things in very like explicit detail, and like the more you dig into it, the more you become your self becomes visible to the things you don't want to find you, and like then they come for you in the night. So we get a lot more technology, which on the one hand seems like, about damn time, but also feels kind of late by the 2000s that we're now starting to think about how do ghosts start interacting with tech. I mean, I'm sure there's films before this that do it, but in the mainstream, I seem to recall that was like a trend, which is weird.
Right.
To me, it just seems like, why are we still doing the telephone thing when we've all had VHS players and have been recording random movies off of our cable networks or whatever for like almost a decade now? Well, I don't get it.
They start doing more with like video games then in horror, and haunted technology becomes more and more of a thing frequently through the years to come.
Yeah,
but
not
even
just
like
the phone.
it's have you seen Session 9?
No.
I need to rewatch it, but watch Session 9. It's got David Caruso in it, but it's an underrated horror where this crew goes to basically a mental institution, or former mental institution, that's supposedly haunted.
Nice.
And I seem to recall that it does that, where it doesn't just sort of replay haunted mental institution movie. It doesn't just redo that, but it does it linked to the technology that they're bringing in as well, if I recall. But when you were talking before, I just thought of that, but as an example, and that was just a few years after this. So
okay, I'll have to check that out then. Well, look, we kind of have to stop.
Okay. If we got it.
Sorry. But yeah, we've been at it for about an hour, and I think that's us trying to keep things tighter. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, if anyone has thoughts for us about this film, if you've seen it and you have thoughts, or you want to compare it to the newer film from 2002, or you just want to yell at us about how much you hate the 2002 version, I guess, you can do that either at skiffingfanty@gmail.com. We also have a listener suggestions page, which is skiffingfanty.com/listener-suggestions. We get a newsletter and a Patreon and all of these things. If you want to find all that, you can go to our link tree, which is linktr.ee/skiffingfanty. You also find all our social networks, although we're basically Skiffy and Fanty on every social network except Shitter. And so if you want to find us, just look for Skiffy and Fanty. We're somewhere out there. Please support us.
But not there.
But not there.
But
don't
not
find
on
us
Shitter.
there. I mean, the account still exists, but we don't do anything with it. Me, Shaun Duke.net. I'm Alphabet Streams here on Twitch, where Skiffy and Fanty is here every Friday at 7 p.m. Central. I have a Patreon, and I'm also on various social networks. My link tree is /Shaun Duke.
You can find me, Daniel, at Reading 1000 Lives on Blue Sky. The number 1000 is the numerals, so 1000. And my reviews, of course, are on the Skiffy and Fanty blog. So if you don't, please make sure you check out our blog. It is wonderful. And many people write great things for it, including Steven, Cam, Trish, and, of course, Paul. And then I also review on reading1000lives.com and elsewhere.
Excellent.
All right. If you haven't seen Ringu, go watch Ringu.
I think it's really good, and people should go see it. I agree. So as required by the Skiffy and Fanty bylaws, I need to make it awkward. And so, Daniel, unbeknownst to you, this has all been a recording. And this recording now is establishing that you only have 7 days to live, unless you bring me a piping hot bowl of tomato bisque within that time frame. If you do, you will live.
Sweet release. Only 1 week to go.
Well, and on that note, I guess, awkward ending and see you.